Good evening, everyone, and welcome to DIA. My name is Matilde Guidelli. I am a curator here, and I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's program, a conversation between Anne Millet and Tiffany Sia, co-organized with Printed Matter and Primary Information on the occasion of the launch of Tiffany's first collection of essays on and off-screen imaginaries. Both Tiffany and me consider hot zones and their representation through sophisticated layering of a place, its histories, and its fantasies. And the artist-on-artist lecture that Tiffany delivered last year here on Anmi's work appears now in her book that ranges the diaristic and the theoretical, frontline, action, and critical distance. One of the concepts that Tiffany proposes here is that of no place. Tiffany writes, "No place is a spatial vision of locales whose specificities are blurred by invasion, violence, and hostility, contested territories, seas ports or battlefields, contact zones or port cities. The no place cannot be known, it remains an enigma and lives on a specter." No Place is also the through line of a film and video program featuring works by Tiffany and me, Rodi Bagawa, Simon Leung, and Rea Tajiri that will remain on view throughout the weekend here from 12 to 6 p.m. And you can find more information at the entrance. So please return for the film and video program and stay after the conversation to buy a book. Tiffany will sign it. And before passing it on to Sonel and James, I wish to thank everyone at DIA who helped make tonight's possible, and in particular, Max Tannon, Liv Cuniberti, Kim Golding, David Anayamaya, and the visitor service team, as well as Primary Information and Printed Matter. And we are most grateful to Roddy, Rhea, and Simon, and of course, to Tiffany and me. And now I'll pass it on to James.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. It's great to see a full house. I'm James Hoff from Primary Information. For those of you that don't know, Primary Information, we are a publisher, a nonprofit publisher of artist books that take the form of facsimile and archival editions, as well as newly commissioned works by today's leading artists. It was a great pleasure to work with Tiffany on her new book, On and Off-Screen Imaginaries. And we are thrilled to have her in conversation tonight with Anne Millet, and as part of an extended film and video program, which will be on view through Saturday. Thanks to everyone for joining, and a special thanks to the DIA team for hosting and organizing this program alongside Printed Matter. In particular, I'd like to thank Matilde from DIA and Sanel and Sunny from Printed Matter. On and Off-Screen Imaginaries would not have been possible without many people, including Matthew Walker, who brought the project to Primary Information, Rachel Walensky's insightful and razor-sharp editing of the publication, and to Bryce Wilner for his incredible and precise design. And of course, none of this would have been possible at all without Tiffany Sia's incredibly insightful work and writing. Lastly, I'd like to thank Anne Millet for joining us tonight. So with that, we should give a round of applause for both Anne Millet and Tiffany. And I will hand it off to Sonel. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will keep this brief. I know we want to hear Anne-Me and Tiffany speak. My name is Sanel Breslov. I'm the Director of Fairs and Editions at Printed Matter. I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you to Matilda and the entire team at DIA. We're really thrilled to have this opportunity to collaborate on this very special program and for the release of Tiffany's new collection of essays, and officially launch Printed Matter and DIA's partnership as part of the New York Art Book Fair. DIA will once again be hosting the Classroom program, which is a free discursive series of 17 programs that will take place over the course of 3 full days alongside the fair. They will be taking place in this room. I'm here to just remind everybody that the fair is less than a month away, and to encourage you to register early for these programs and for attending and purchasing your tickets for the fair as soon as possible. The website is pmabf.org. The fair is taking place just across the street at 548 West 22nd Street from April 25th to the 28th. Printed Matter and Dia's relationship spans many decades, including hosting the first 2 New York Art Book Fairs in 548 West 22nd Street. And it's been really wonderful to rekindle this relationship in the last couple years through the Classroom Partnership and with Dia's wonderful team. For this evening's program, we're excited to be collaborating with our friends at Primary Information. Thank you to Matthew and James, and a big congratulations to Tiffany on this beautiful book. I'm personally really looking forward to this conversation between you and me, and I thank you both for being part of this program today. And just a last round of applause to welcome our speakers tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Also, just gonna, these rooms are sort of intimidating when you first kind of look at them. But hopefully this whole thing will just dissolve and it'll feel like an intimate conversation. I do want to thank some people, so I'm sorry for thanking the stacks on stacks of many thanks, but writing a book is a bit like a solo sport, but a solo sport with many different people on the sidelines and supporting you and training you throughout. This little book requires many thanks to many people. Just to take a moment to help to thank those people and for making this event possible. Thank you for Matilde, Jessica, and the whole DIA team. Thank you also to the Printed Matter team. On and Off-Screen Imaginaries exists in this world because of Primary Information. Huge thank you to James Hoff and Matthew Walker. It was my dream, my secret dream, to publish with Printed Matter, and now it is a reality, so it means so much to me. Thank you to Rachel Valinsky for your incredibly sensitive and uncannily telepathic edits. Also, thank you to Allison Dubinsky for copy edits. Thank you to Bryce Wilner for your incredible work on the design of the book. You helped me realize a montage on paper. And to Jean Ma, who's not here today, but she wrote the foreword, and her friendship is huge, and her work is a huge influence on the book. Thank you to Felix Gaudlitz and Maxwell Graham, who's in the audience, for your support, humor, and partnership, holding me through some weird times. I want to thank my colleagues at my day job, Hélène Sylvain, who was one of the people I wished would have read my book the most, and whom I miss every day. To my closest friends, whom I put off seeing for about 3 years to write this book. I also want to thank Andrew Vaterlau-Stabi, my husband, and my parents, and my Aunt Macy, who passed while I was writing this book. This book obviously marks a lot of loss. There are many more people to thank, but also, last but not least, to Radhi Bagawa, Ria Tajiri, Simon Leung, and Anmi Lei. And for a book born out of conversation, inspired by so many conversations, I'm so grateful and so honored to enact this launch with you through a conversation.
Oh, great. Thank you for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here and help you celebrate the publication of this collection of essays. You are an incredibly rigorous thinker and wonderful writer, and I hope I can contribute something valuable to this conversation tonight.
I don't know what to say to that, other than I don't know how to do justice to how much I adore your work, other than having written that essay.
We'll just keep, lobbing compliments to each other for the rest of the night.
I guess maybe I can start somewhere. Maybe actually reading the No Place is a good place to start.
Yeah. And I'd love to ask you more questions about,
Yeah, I can, let's see. My stationary method does not work when I'm trying to find the thing. Okay. Vietnam of the mind is a fictive place. It is a no place, not a non-place in the words of Marc Auger, who attaches this term to sites such as airports, shopping malls, or hotel rooms, transient locations where human beings remain anonymous. Rather, no place is a vision of locales whose specificities are blurred by invasion, violence, and hostility, contested territories, seized ports or battlefields, contact zones, or port cities. When confronted with An Milei's landscape photographs, I am interested in using Gordon Chang's conversational proposition of no place as a way to embrace a poetic elliptical absence of return, resolution, or completion. These are places that have gone through such a violent transfiguration that they are rendered neither neutral nor anonymized, but rather take on a slippery quality. The no place cannot be known. It remains an enigma and lives on as a specter. Yeah, so maybe, I don't know, beginning there. I mean, I think in some ways the book in many ways anticipates the concept of the no place. The book begins with Hong Kong, and then it kind of abruptly shifts geography into the US, to Vietnam, and then also to Taiwan, and to thinking just generally in the sort of methodologies of trying to think of how to narrate geopolitics, not necessarily through the binary of the Cold War, but through these elsewhere sites, the kind of other places that mark this kind of inconvenient way to tell global history, and a neat ideological container for this. History becomes messy and kind of like an inconvenient.
Yeah, I think that you're right in saying that history is messy, and I think that's why you've focused on the study of the way history is researched and the methodology of history. I kind of found my way fumbling through the dark, as a landscape photographer in working in this place that you call no place, that I didn't really know how to define until I read your essay. I think that as someone who's lived in exile, and you talk about Edward Said's definition of what that means, to have to deal with multiple cultures, multiple homes, none of them really are your homes, and what does that mean? And so, in a way, I think it puts you in a place where that you have to define for yourself in a way. So I almost feel that that's kind of what every artist, every author would want, is to have this no man's land that you can make it your own workplace, your own playground. And for me as a landscape photographer, I think that I didn't really understand what landscape meant until I was able to return to Vietnam for the first time since we left at the end of the war. So President Clinton renewed relations with Vietnam, and I was able to travel. And I had struggled trying to figure out how to make a landscape photograph. And I remember being in graduate school trying to photograph in Connecticut, and the pictures were utter failures because I didn't understand. There was no history, there was no connection. But arriving in Vietnam, suddenly everything was inscribed there for me. And of course, the landscape is contemporary. It's not the landscape that I had dreamt about or missed or pined about, but it was all there, It was about culture, it was about history, whiffs of ideology. It was also about the way people worked the land, and suddenly the notion of scale made sense to me. And I think that's when I started trying to describe this place that is no place,
And I think also that's where the sort of imaginary comes in, and what you describe as the Vietnam of the mind. I mean, it's funny also doing this talk when it was a one-way mirror in some ways for me to have done the Dia talk, where I didn't necessarily consult you when I was writing it, but I was listening to all these interviews and kind of researching. And, there's always a danger with that, right? Like, you don't want to twist somebody's meaning in a way that feels uncomfortable for them, but then you're like announcing it in such a public space. So it's funny that it's like when this happens, this is almost like this, like kind of the tables are turned a little bit, and I get to hear from you how that imaginary came about, how the Vietnam of the mind came about.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you don't have access to something, your imagination just revs up. And of course, the notion of memory is so important, and it's such a slippery notion. What do you remember? What do you forget? And it's all malleable. And so I think that everything that happens in your mind is just ripe for exploitation and for looking for something tangential and tangible for me, and that's what the landscape came to be. So I feel that my landscape have something a little bit almost fantasy-like, but they're grounded in contemporary Vietnam from the 90s, but they're also kind of satisfied a kind of yearning for something past that I was looking for. But when I make pictures and they're done or the project is finished, I kind of let it go. And so I think it's great that you were able to find some inspiration, and I have no issues with the way you ran with it. So,
yeah, for me, you're such a cinematic thinker that the format of a talk and doing the talk with the sort of montage, what would inevitably be montage by going through the sequence of photography within Small Wars, that it would be enacting a kind of cinema. Even this kind of structure of people seated in rows and then a projected image. The only thing that might be different is that there's a speaker on stage. And so there was something to me kind of exciting about totally taking that format and rewiring it really to really connect your practice in some ways, as you're talking about memory, but I feel like so much of it is like televisual memory, is like media memory of Vietnam, and is also media memory with various distancing and telescoping. Apocalypse Now, and then
absolutely, yeah, and it's all an accumulation. When you don't have access to the real thing. So Apocalypse Now, Rambo, news, and Vietnam through porn, everything. Yeah.
And I really related to that with Hong Kong. I really related to that. There was this one connection for me with Hong Kong artist Simon Leung, who was talking about this childhood television memory of watching reportage about the Vietnam War as a child when he had first moved to the US. And at that moment, watching the news was a signal to him that he was very, very far away from Vietnam and Asia. And he intuited, it's like, but it's just really interesting to me, that kind of childhood memory and like the immediate distancing that this child senses through this report. Of course, the language, right? It's in English, but still, like, there's immediately this kind of like, I'm very far away from, and then, so anyway, that was the connecting point for me. But, Hong Kong cinema is such a big global export. Hugely influential also on Hollywood cinema, and its impact on these mediums is, and even in terms of thinking about like shooting in Asia, shooting like war, films about Vietnam and Asia and in the Philippines.
Elsewhere than in Vietnam.
Yeah, and reenacting this. So there was almost this kind of like this non-specificity of Asian territory, of this sort of Asian terrain that I feel in some ways I see in moments in genre works around Vietnam, but also genre works around like kind of the opposite of, that kind of like war genre. But then in Hong Kong, it sort of has this Blade Runner cyberpunk kind of like hyper-modernity cityscape kind of cop movie thing, maybe. So genres become so sort of like malleable and mobile as they move through these spaces, and then they are also the thing that like it captures these images and then circulates them globally, and then that's what people remember. So I think I was really playing with that. I mean, it's funny that you're even talking about the genre of porn, because the first printed publications that I had was called Salty Wet, which has like a softcore porn magazine, and then Too Salty, Too Wet, which is kind of like a deadening of erotics in a sense, but again, kind of playing with this weird line of like this kind of sensational feminine East, which, you know, again connects to Said and Orientalism and kind of, yeah, this imaginary of place. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of work within a genre and then to try to deconstruct it slowly. And it's one way to kind of draw the viewer in, and also then create some kind of estrangement or defamiliarization of the subject matter. Yeah, it's but so can you tell me the influence of your thinking and your writing and your research on your artwork and how they inform your artwork?
Yeah, text is often a way first for me. It's like a way to reading and text. Writing is just such an important, it's probably the practice that I've had the longest relationship with. And is the way that I figure out the world or make sense of the world or reconstruct some sense of loss. And then I think in many ways the practice in film, and sometimes as it appears as video and installation in different forms, is thinking through some of those questions that I know I can't necessarily do on a page. And there are some things that I've found stop on a page for me, and they become kind of that I have to experiment with them beyond the page, and I can't resolve them in text. And so when I can't resolve them in text, or when they need to remain ineffable, they kind of, that's when it leaves the page. But text is the point of inquiry. Text is the sort of like vehicle for me. Yeah, it's funny that you also say the word estrangement, because I think that's a big part of this book. That's been I feel like a big part of my recent work. It's also thinking about Chinese cinema or Sinophone cinema and the trope of the family, the trope of the big family within Sinophone cinema, this kind of like return, this reuniting with the big family, these types of things within Chinese culture. But then I think estrangement is a really interesting kind of opposite to that. And estrangement is something that I keep thinking about in terms of also thinking about politics and political disenchantment, which is written about in the book a lot. But yeah, I mean, for me, the estrangement is kind of a really active term in thinking about diasporic identity and history. This kind of shattering, the family not coming together, but the family having distance.
Yeah. Yeah, I look for estrangement in the landscape. And I think sometimes I feel that the subject matter that I choose has potential for that. And, I'm always interested in describing something, as clearly as possible, and still hoping that you would get that kind of estrangement, and definitely a kind of, and be defamiliarized with what you're looking at and what that landscape makes you think of.
It's interesting because also in looking at your photographs, there's this kind of elaborating on the estrangement is also this kind of like not giving an easy solution, or not giving an easy answer, or even an exit route almost.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah. There's this particular active, very like frictionful sense of ambivalence, you know, this sort of paradox at play.
Well, you write about it so beautifully in terms of this elliptical way of thinking and this elliptical way of putting things together. Can you talk more about that?
The elliptical for me is kind of a very active gesture throughout the book. I think it's 6 essays, a compendium of 6 essays, and each essay has a kind of, I played piano since I was 4, so a lot of my thinking actually comes from music and just listening to like long symphonies or something like that, but that kind of helps me figure out pacing sometimes, or like how taut to make something. So there are certain essays that are taut. And then the last essay is a little bit looser in some ways. But the elliptical is this thing that recurs throughout each essay. There are little Easter eggs in some ways. The elliptical is mentioned in the text about your work, and then it also appears again in the last essay, but it also is something that is within elliptical returns, which is the essay on Sun Ziwon's film Blue Island, and the elliptical returns being the elliptical returns of history, and successive revolution and successive upheaval, and not being able to exit from successive upheaval.
Right. Great. You mentioned the ineffable, and I always think of the ineffable and the sublime as something that really interests me. So can you talk about that within the context of the no place? You know, it made sense. That's the first thing I thought of when I read about.
The one thing that I didn't quite resolve, and I don't know why this only came to me like after the book was published, but really no place is about forgetting. I mean, maybe that's very clear in the essay, but I don't exactly explicitly say that. But no place is about the kind of almost making a historical event out of amnesia, historical amnesia and erasure. So I think that's where the ineffability comes, but then you also get these other gestures in the book around ghosts.
Yeah,
and
haunted landscapes.
Haunted landscapes, the unresolved, the restless, and all of these things kind of circulate around this loss of memory, or loss of detail, or like missed, coming into those pictures, especially in your pictures and your photographs as well. But I also think about the essay Phantasms of Dissent, where with the tear gas coming into the frame and occupying a lot of the frame. It's an obscurant. And so there's this kind of like detail, information in the frame, in the picture, but then this kind of like retracting, blurring. For me, I think dealing with the ineffable through a medium of effability, or articulating that, I think there's a little bit of a game to retain that mystery around it, and I think that game is a bit of poetics.
Yeah, well, photography has that paradox, right? Like, how do you make something ineffable when you're trying to describe the real world in as much specificity as possible? And that has always fascinated me, and it's a struggle. But then, I feel that it's a battle worth fighting every time. I always tell my students, like, try to describe something. Don't photograph someone doing something. The idea of doing something, but actually describe that act, and that's something that they don't always understand. And speaking of mist or haunted landscape, sometimes my students are interested in that, and so they think that less information is the better, and I'm always pushing, no, you need more information to describe, something that is obscured, or something that is misty, or something that is not completely present.
Yeah, there's something in the book where I think towards the last essay, I kind of talk about this idea of if you say the thing aloud, you kill it. If you say it directly, you kill it. So how much can you kind of skirt around it? And then I think it also is the thing that summons the ghost in some ways and summons the haunting, I think, for the viewer and for the reader, you know, by skirting so close to it without actually putting it there also creates something else. And I'm surprised sometimes when even doing a gesture like that like somebody is going to still feel that sense of dread or, you know, that I'm trying for. Because sometimes, you know, that's a risk. It's like you risk illegibility, which I feel like I do in all of my work, as a slightly risking that, you know?
Well, I think it goes back to what you said about Said saying that it's about contrapunctum, right? And so I'm not interested in photographs that have a punctum, but I'm interested in, like you said, multiple punctums and skirting things and allowing people to move through the text or moving through the image or the film and slowly picking up information and understanding the layering and coming away with a more rewarding experience.
Yeah, it's funny because it's a piano term, contrapuntal, and it's like basically a kind of playing of like right hand and left hand, not necessarily left hand. I don't know if you play as well, but
my daughter does.
But they play on their own, and they're two different lines of music happening at the same time, and you kind of have to keep their simultaneity. But in their simultaneity, there's something kind of, there's like a new tension. There's like a third thing or something that happens. I don't know if I'm doing a great job at paraphrasing exactly this, but the contrapuntal, I think, is exactly, there's something at play, I think, also within the obvious layer of the image, and then the underlying layer of the image.
The underpainting, and the kind of push and pull constantly.
I wonder if I can maybe read from another part of, maybe about time. This section is from Phantasms of Dissent on the two documentary works of the anonymous collective Hong Kong documentary filmmakers. In a time of revolt, a revolt against time is the title of this section. Resisting conventions of advocacy, documentary, and journalism that reduce any collective voice to individual ones, the Hong Kong Documentary Filmmakers Group has created a view of protest and social change. A surfeit of fierce divisions and negotiations within the movement overflows onto the streets. This style of documentary filmmaking, carefully assembling messy, dispersed materials from multiple filmmakers so that they form one narrative, engages the viewer in the liveliness of these events, unfiltered in advance of any narrativization to be produced by historians, news anchors, or even elite activists. Quote, "The standard account promoted by revolutionary elites, political scientist James C. Scott argues, is buttressed by the way in which historical process itself naturalizes the world, erasing evidence of its contingency. In the same way, none of the historical participants in, say, World War I or the Battle of the Bulge, not to mention the Reformation or the Renaissance, knew at the time that they were participating in anything that could be so summarily described," unquote. In the aftermath of 2019, the protests have often been described in shorthand as a pro-democracy movement. While the aim of the protest was indeed to attain universal suffrage, the difference between struggles in the street and confrontations with police as depicted in Taking Back the Legislature and Inside the Red Brick Wall tells a nuanced tale of political strategies and their efficacy. Such significant disagreements captured on the front line illuminate a critical oral history, what Scott calls the evidence of a historical event's contingency. When the filmmakers themselves, uncertain even of the outcome of the day, every minute captured seems to portend a key turning point, an unknowable outcome just around the bend. And then I think I'm going to pick off right here. The perspective of the camera veers from a cloud of tear gas to wide shots of police clearing the street, indicative of the dispersed angles around the event by filmmakers operating as a collective. At the end, a single camera comes up into the empty halls of the Legislative Council, breathless, as if to catch a glimpse of it one last time, moving from a direct cinema style to a subtle imprint of verite. The camera operator can be heard breathing as the camera affords a view of a defamed legislative hall. So I think that's a, big tension throughout the book, is this kind of like history as it becomes naturalized and told and sort of official in text in some ways. And the text is trying to inconvenience that and trying to think about where those tellings often might obscure other tellings that are a bit more and throughout the book, kind of beginning, actually I'm very reluctant to do this, but beginning to deal with my family history and how much that has kind of pushed me to being interested in history in the first place.
Do you feel that you sort of, it's paradoxical, but are you creating your own primary sources in a way with the writing?
Yeah, in some ways, I think that's true, yeah.
Because you didn't have any, and there were all these gaps, and so
totally,
you have the freedom as an artist to step up and...
Yeah. The first essay, that's why it's written in the first person.
Yeah, and then...
Not because I love the first person, I kind of hate the first person.
Yeah.
But then the first person is the way to actually create the primary source.
Yeah.
So then it's the device towards that.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. And then you switch to... When do you switch to
and
the
then
third
I switched,
person? I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, third person, this is my joke with myself, but I feel like it's like I'm LARPing, like a live action role playing as a film scholar when I write Phantasms of Descent and Elliptical Returns. And then, so those two are third person. And then it returns to first person, but kind of almost second person, because it's like I'm addressing the symposium. And then your essay, which is kind of between all those, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great that we talked about this, because while I was reading, I was thinking, there's theory or art theory, and then there's history, right, which is all primary sources. And it seems that if you look at theory through a particular lens, then everything makes sense. While with history, it all depends on your primary sources. You're actually bringing the two branches together, and I think that's...
What I also think is funny about working through theory is that there are some things that are not called theory, like when it's written by an Asian scholar, then it's called cultural studies. Like Akbar Abbas. He's a theorist, but he's also called a cultural, he's like a cultural studies. So I think that there's this funny thing also, this kind of like trap of area studies. And then also the trap also of area studies vis-a-vis the Cold War. I was able to study Mandarin through a Fulbright, which is very much part of the structure of funding for American students studying in Asia. And so there are these funny tracks of, these kinds of the funny things of, I'm not a scholar, I have just a BA, so I pirated a lot of these texts that I cite, read them on my commute to work, things like that. So there's this funny reworking of very official texts in some ways, but then also like trying to make Hong Kong studies in particular more, I don't know, not just important, but like actually to be reckoned with, and as a method to think through multiple places and not just Hong Kong.
Right, to make it immediate and for it to matter.
Yeah, because Akbar Abbas writes about the culture of disappearance, and I'm like, well, is that specific to Hong Kong, or could you actually apply culture of disappearance to New York? There's something kind of in the way that I also cite different texts, you know, like citing James C. Scott, but then also Edward Said. You know, there's just a lot. Or I'm trying to think of Baldwin also shows up in the book. And then Tai Fu, who I think contributed to your book as well. Yeah. So there are these many different scholars who are maybe messily on the page with one another. There's something in exciting to me about offering a place that's not to say that these are exceptional histories or that this is an exceptional history, but that in saying that it's not an exceptional history, it's to make it in relation to all these places.
Yeah, for sure. I think something else that I also wanted to talk about was that, you know, because I think we're so focused and so committed to trying to make sense of what has happened to us and our history and the erasures and the absences and the haunting and all of this. And I also wanted to say that, you know, we should not necessarily idealize, you know, the notion of people who've grown up in one single place and have had some sort of Edenic upbringing, you know, one home, one culture. You know, it presents its own problems. And I think when I get a little desperate, you know, I think about that. And yeah, anyway, I don't know.
Yeah. No, yeah, it's interesting because, yeah, this book really just has almost exclusively studied like figures that are exilic, right? I think your work, even in looking at King Hu, the films of King Hu, he was born in Beijing and left as a child. And then he never returned, but he worked in Hong Kong and in Taiwan.
In Taiwan, yeah.
So, yeah, I think, I don't know how to respond to that lesson, but I'm going to take it.
I don't know. I wasn't saying it for you, but I think I was saying it for myself sometimes, you know.
No, it's something that it can be dizzying, I think, to be holding that that weird sense of place and loss, but also even if one were to return, that it would be not the place, and as you did in Small Wars. And so that I think is so alive for me when I was endlessly listening to lectures of Edward Said and reading his text before like days of writing. I would constantly think about him specifically and him talking about this contrapuntal concept and even reading Orientalism, you know, in college and writing like 15 papers just trying to make sense of that. And I don't know if, you know, I'm not sure if he, like, it's also, it's interesting, it's like this concept, Orientalism, is also exactly this imaginary, right? It's exactly to think about the consequential impact of imaginaries, geopolitically or historically on places, and to study that lens, I think that is, it's like to write about the image, but also to write about the lens. I think this book wouldn't be what it is if I hadn't been like completely bowled over by that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that when you're stretched thin and pulled in multiple directions, I think that's when things reveal themselves, right? And so I think being torn between different cultures, different thinking, different ideas, and different obligations, is I think ultimately helps you learn something. And at the same time, I missed Vietnam, and I was, looking at news pictures and not focusing on the main event, which was always devastating, but looking in the corner and looking at the woman in the Aozai or the bicycle or the person who was selling food sitting on the edge of the picture. I was looking at those details and pining for something that I probably didn't even know anymore. But at the same time, there are difficulties with families. There are difficulties with where you come from. And so it was always I was always torn about that notion of home, or what is home.
Yeah. Or even the figure of the child in those shots, and studying, or maybe just naturally the child drifts into frame almost, right? Because I wonder if you were consciously looking for that, or just sort of happened. Yeah,
I think it just happened. I think as a photographer, you have ideas, and I don't work in a studio. I don't construct sets, but I try to look for things in the world that somehow not illustrate my ideas, but somehow bring forth those ideas. And it's kind of hard to know what we'll do. And so I think subconsciously, yes, I was photographing a lot of children. And you're working on a project about the figure of the child. But I think that the figure of the child has to do with not just resilience, but the notion of future, of a potential. I think I never wanted the child to be a victim of war, which, I struggled with. I think people saw me as a victim of war, and that's something I was fought against. And so when I returned to Vietnam, I wanted to photograph children, maybe who was suffering, and they were not always very well off, but they exuded resilience, they exuded a kind of positivity towards the future in spite of the difficulty. So tell us about your project.
Well, it's really, I think, it was something I was really fascinated by, probably like this one idea that I had maybe like 7 years ago, in terms of like thinking about like this unresolved figure of the child in cinema. But I really got to actually work out a lot of those questions in writing the essay on your work. And the trope of the child, I mean, maybe this sounds a little bit counter to logic, but often the trope to infantilize the child in cinema, to treat the child as a wholly innocent figure, which is kind of Christian in value in some sense. But there is this kind of, but there is a knowingness of the child, and the child also, I mean, even in that example of Simon Leung watching TV at the age of 8 or 9, and immediately understanding through that experience of watching the television that he was very far away from those events. And the child encountering the adult world and learning of the adult world. I felt like I really encountered this process through writing about the figure of the child in your work. And it's also the kind of like melancholy of the child is also encountering the adult world. I mean, in certain films like Kramer versus Kramer, or this kind of child protagonist is this vessel for a family drama. But I think in this new work that I've been this new video work that I'm working on is thinking about the child as this vessel for not just the drama of the family unit, but the drama of the world, in similar ways to Simon. That moment, that very particular single moment, but then right now I'm working through my dad's memories as a child when his family and he left Shanghai and went to Hong Kong in the mid-50s. And so, but retaining the kind of like blurry, impressionistic kind of memory, you know, eating ice cream in a communist banquet hall. There are no other details, just this, he's so happy to eat ice cream here. And then you happen to know the setting. So I think the trope of the child, I think, you know, in cinema is interesting in this way. It's like Spielberg treats the child as the child protagonist as this adventure seeker, but there's something, and the child is there's more contradictions than that, and they're encountering this other world.
So what kind of footage are you using for this project?
Like early Mao era cartoons made by Shanghai, like animation production companies of that era. And I think some of them actually left Shanghai after, like probably pre-67. But they're actually not even television memories my dad had. His earliest television memory is like the Johnny Carson show when he watched TV in Hong Kong as an adult. So yeah, they're sort of like cartoons for an audience of no child.
It took me forever to understand the humor, you know,
of the Johnny Carson show.
Yeah, forever.
Yeah, he watched Laugh-In too. Laugh-In and Johnny Carson.
He's so sophisticated.
His introduction to the other side of the Cold War curtain.
I mean, one thing that I feel that one of our interests is, you know, in terms of conflict, right? I think we're both interested in the effect of conflict and war and dislocation, diaspora, on people, on humans, not you know, a description of devastation, not a description of combat, and I think we're interested in the effect of war and geopolitical forces and on people, on families. Can you maybe?
It's funny because as a child, the only books that I read in full that were assigned to me were books on war. For some reason, I was very fixated on finishing them from beginning to end. I did not care for other books because what I felt like was the lesson in those books and the reason why one had to read it from beginning to end was the durational quality, that this was the closest thing to understanding what an event of war could be like. And a lot of writing around revolution or war, I think, is around the kind of apogee of the apogee of political becoming or the kind of climax of a particular event. But I think in this book, On and Off-Screen Imaginaries, I was really interested in all the aftermaths. So even though there's this maybe perception of it's a bit of a trick because Phantasms of Dissent, even though it's on the works of Hong Kong documentary filmmakers and their depiction of the protests, really that essay is about the consequence of circulation of those films. and then and the other kind of like consequences of circulation and the fallout of that. And so in history's aftermaths, I think for me is like also what I'm interested in, the things that are left open and unresolved, that continue to haunt, and that also continue to fester and then ferment even the next thing and likely the next thing. I think that's the thing that I was really fixated on, particularly this affect of like political disenchantment. I was really haunted by former chief executive Carrie Lam. She apparently was an activist in the 70s. She was also, I think, she was doing social work. So what happened?
People change, yes.
Yeah, I'm very interested in that, this kind of notion of political disenchantment. And I think it's not just about sort of holding this sort of like the moment of the heroic climax of revolution, but actually I think the most important part is holding those tensions and to not give in to sort of easy or reactionary conclusions that might produce another Carrie Lam or some, that's an example, but yeah, disenchantment is a big question, because disenchantment is also to face current history.
Will you read something else?
Let's see. A heartbreaking party scene unfolds. At a gathering for the Hong Kong Federation of Students' 60th anniversary in a bustling banquet hall, Lam is seen among colleagues and activists. On the stage, he gives a speech addressing the room. Quote, "When we were young, we dreamt of a better world. I never expected to know the meaning of shattered faith. Let me tell you, 1989 was such a historic moment. In its aftermath, the world plunged into deeper darkness. I fell asleep and refused to wake up at the Federation of Students because I didn't want to face reality." Unquote. One of the people he speaks to at the party is an individual working on the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau Bridge, who beams with excitement over the promise of a rising GDP thanks to infrastructure from the Belt and Road Initiative. He also speaks to others about the Occupy Central 9 case. Even though they have the best lawyers for their defense, they have no strategy. Quote, "The charges the government laid are carefully chosen," Lam says to a group of younger individuals. Quote, "Since the 90s, we have felt like deserters. I felt like I needed to take care of myself and my family first before doing what was my duty. I often felt that this was a bit lacking. So when I see you guys, I feel very ashamed." As Kenneth Lam makes his way through the party, a few younger faces emerge, with subtitles introducing them. Lester Shum, awaiting trial since January 2021. Leo Tang, sentenced to 4 months to prison in 2020. Nathan Lau, awaiting trial since January 2021. Benny Tai, one of those convicted in the Occupy Central 9 case, awaiting trial since January 2021. And No Hin, awaiting trial since January 2021. Lam confesses to Tang on behalf of his generation, as theirs is fighting on the streets. "We owe you too much." Lam's admission is tragic, as though to suggest that his generation's failed resistance produced the historical debt that has been deferred to the next, in this case, their grandchildren. The presence of these intertitles and their silence, Chan chooses not to interrupt these scenes, is haunting. Amid the loudness in the room, the events that this scene foreshadows underline the ongoing tectonic shifts in the social and political landscape that undergirds everyone there.
Do you hope that your work will make a difference? Is that something you think about, or?
I feel like my work is pretty useless, to be honest, in making a difference. I feel like my work is probably closer to trying to make a dent in primary primary sources. One of many future primary sources, or secondary sources in some ways. But yeah, it's profoundly useless. But I think that there's something exciting about that.
Great.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. It has been really inspiring to hear both of you. I love both of your works. I guess the question of the distancing is very interesting because I feel like both of your work still look back at the home that's no longer the home, or it's imaginary home. And you have you seem to have like a distance and limited access to what seems to be an interesting subject. So I'm curious how you deal with the fact that like the place you want to write about the most or film about the most or take photograph of the most are the places you can't go back to. And how do you creatively solve that distance to still have access and not make the distance grow longer and longer and becoming really a pure imagination?
I don't think history is very imaginary, or maybe memory is kind of that. But I think in one of the actually, in writing the essay on your work, there's a part where I didn't read aloud in the performance talk, actually, and that is specifically around this sort of notion of leaving in some ways, but I think what leaving does to memory and what leaving does to memory of place. And I think that can be experienced on either side of it. So I'll just read it. Vietnam has been a contested territory in the consolidation of empires for centuries. Since 420 CE, Vietnam has alternately been colonized and invaded by China, France, Japan, the British Empire, and the United States. To illustrate the capacity of nationalistic ideology to rewrite memory, Benedict Anderson evokes a historical anecdote that belies the country's sovereignty. Anderson observes, the name Vietnam was scornfully invented by a 19th century Manchu dynasty to refer to a territory conquered by the Han 17 centuries earlier and reputed to cover today's Chinese provinces of Guangdong and Guangxi, as well as the Red River Valley, which is sort of my joke about connecting us geographically.
Right. Fluvial.
Despite the Vietnamese court privately inventing another name for its own kingdom, the ambivalently adopted name, Anderson continues, reminds us of Ernest Renan's dictum that nations must have forgotten many things. Nationalism relies on amnesia, a considerable amount of mass forgetting to gain power. Places like dates become multivalent. Tai Fu chronicles one historic date that describes the splintering of memory. April 30th is a day of liberation, according to Socialist Republic of Vietnam. For overseas Vietnamese, however, this is Black April, the anniversary of the day in 1975 when the Republic of Vietnam disappeared. The commemorations are rites of remembrance as a form of reenactment, unquote. A double gaze might also describe the splintering of historical dates into two meanings, and how the vicissitudes of war create a divided national consciousness that lives on in the diaspora. So to answer your question, in some ways, the diasporic memory is also the inconvenient memory.
I mean, nationalism is a construct, and so I think it's I can take it to task, and I think photography is a construct, and so I think that's what we've been doing. Yeah.
Hi, I'm not sure if I'm remembering this correctly, but in the book you talk about a movie called Boat People by An Hui, and one of the things that's interesting about it is sort of kind of the messiness of An Hui's political coordinates. Like, again, I'm not sure if I'm remembering this correctly, but the movie is partly state-sponsored, and then a decade later, it's banned by the government. And I guess sort of picking up on the last question that you guys were talking about, to what extent do you think, I guess, that a certain level of political ambiguity in your work has to do with like trying to be truthful instead of trying to capture something that is in essence ineffable, you know?
I think maybe I'll start by describing that. Have you seen Boat People? Yeah. So there's an interesting... so An Hui's work is... She's a Hong Kong filmmaker who... Her work has been kind of described in the genre of like socialist realism. She directed this film called Boat People about Vietnamese refugees who went to Hong Kong. And the interesting thing in researching that film, that film was one of the executive directors was a former executive at Xinhua News Agency, like a state news agency. And it was told to her that it was basically funded as anti-Vietnam propaganda from China. So there is this interesting thing to kind of connect to Tai Fu, the historian who writes about your work, is to not just is to break the sort of like mold or genre of talking about the Cold War through East-West conflict, but actually there were many North-South conflicts. And so to kind of return to your question, it's like, it's not necessarily political ambiguity as much as it is to see less binary, more a lattice of overlapping contradictions. And I think that is probably closer to viewing what that what those tensions are at play actually when we're carefully studying these inconvenient documents of history.
Yeah, I think I'm interested in the collateral damage of conflicts, and more than in trying to prove something, and definitely I'm not interested in truth in my photography. So I think it's more about bringing different perspectives and trying to hopefully shed light in a different way instead of making a point about political ideas or which is right and which is not.
One of the things I was almost going to write about was another meaning in the term sublime. In when I was writing about your work, another meaning of the sublime is think like within Buddhism, one of the sublime states is equanimity. And there is this radical sense of equanimity at play in your work. This kind of, it's not necessarily like this acceptance, but it's almost,
Well, it's also, I guess the sublime is when you're in awe of something and this fear, and you realize there's greater force at work than you can actually control or ever get a sense of. And maybe it's a kind of humility also in that it's bigger than me and I try my best, but I don't have all the answers. But I still want to understand and I still want to know.
Yeah. It's like the humility
I hope it's not frustrating, but yeah.
But it's that kind of humility of acceptance that is the thing that makes this kind of like so-called Buddhist virtue. I think that was so alive for me in your work. I didn't really know how to deal with that because I'm also kind of reluctant to go into writing about religion and the spiritual, but yeah.
I'll think about that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Anne-Mi and Tiffany, and thank you all for coming. And I think the questions can continue outside at the sign-in desk. Thank you so much.